Shadows clung to her skin like a second armor. Born to the fiercest pack in the northern highlands, she possessed no claws, no fangs, and no inner wolf. Yet, as the reigning Alpha King approached to decree her banishment, his invincible primal instincts screamed a single, terrifying command: retreat. Born into the aristocratic hierarchy of the Carter pack, Gwendolyn Hayes was deemed a biological impossibility, a cruel joke played by the moon goddess. Pack law dictated that every child of lichen descent would experience their first shift by their 18th winter. Gwendolyn, now 22, had never so much as grown an elongated canine. In a brutal medieval society where strength was measured by the ferocity of one's inner beast, a wolfless woman was worse than dead. She was a walking omen of misfortune. Gwendolyn survived only through the lingering respect commanded by her late father, Commander Arthur Hayes, a decorated war hero who had perished defending the previous monarch. Out of sheer obligation, the royal court permitted her to remain within the towering stone walls of Castle Airy, though she was stripped of her noble titles and relegated to the dim, damp archives as a lowly scribe and apothecary assistant. She spent her days grinding bitter herbs and cataloging ancient pack lineages, hidden away from the sneers of the nobility. Life in the castle was an endless cycle of cold stone, heavy labor, and quiet humiliation. Gwendolyn learned to shrink herself, to walk silently along the edges of the grand corridors, masking her scent with crushed mint and rosemary to avoid aggravating the territorial instincts of the palace guards. She accepted her fate. She believed she was broken, an empty vessel wandering among apex predators. Everything shifted on the eve of the winter solstice. King Alistair Carter had finally returned from a grueling 3-year campaign against the rogue factions of the Northern Reaches. Alistair was a terrifying figure, a man carved from ruthless ambition and raw, untamed power. Standing well over 6 feet, with piercing amber eyes and shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of his fractured kingdom, his very presence demanded absolute submission. His wolf was a monstrous, pure black beast of legend, rumored to have torn through entire enemy battalions without sustaining a single scratch. To celebrate the king's victorious return, a grand banquet was thrown in the great hall. Roaring hearths cast flickering, golden light over the endless tables piled high with roasted meats, heavy breads, and overflowing chalices of spiced wine. Courtiers draped in velvet and furs laughed and boasted, the air thick with the potent, overwhelming sense of alpha dominance, musky perfumes, and roasted game. Gwendolyn had been drafted from the archives to serve the high table, a punishment orchestrated by Lady Genevieve Croft, a spiteful noblewoman who sought to become the king's chosen mate. Clutching a heavy silver pitcher of wine, Gwendolyn kept her eyes glued to the floorboards, carefully navigating the chaotic space behind the high table. Disaster struck with agonizing slowness. Lord Richard Harrington, a cunning and ambitious nobleman known for his treacherous political maneuvering, abruptly pushed his heavy oak chair backward. The wooden leg caught Gwendolyn's ankle. She stumbled, her balance failing as the heavy silver pitcher slipped from her soot-stained hands. It crashed violently against the stone floor, splashing dark red wine across the polished boots of King Alistair Carter. Silence slammed into the great hall like a physical weight. The boisterous music choked off. The laughter died. Hundreds of glowing, predatory eyes snapped toward the clumsy servant who had just defiled the reigning monarch. Gwendolyn dropped to her knees, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs as she scrambled to clean the mess with the hem of her coarse linen apron. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I meant no disrespect." Alistair slowly turned his massive frame, his amber eyes locked onto the kneeling girl. He inhaled sharply, prepared to unleash a devastating roar of alpha command that would shatter her eardrums. Instead, a violently powerful, invisible force slammed into his chest. The moment Alistair caught her scent, the world simply stopped. Beneath the sharp, masking smell of crushed mint, there was something intoxicatingly sweet vanilla, rain-soaked earth, and ozone. It was the undeniable, earth-shattering scent of his fated mate. His soul recognized hers in an instant, an ancient magic binding them together across the ether. But a fraction of a second later, another sensation crashed over him. Alistair's inner wolf, the monstrous, undefeated beast that feared neither death nor God, suddenly recoiled. A profound, paralyzing terror ripped through the king's mind. His wolf whimpered, tucking its tail and retreating to the darkest corners of his consciousness. As Gwendolyn tentatively raised her head, her deep hazel eyes meeting the king's glowing amber ones, Alistair saw it. Lurking just beneath the surface of this fragile, wolfless girl was an aura of suffocating, primordial darkness. It was not a wolf. It was something infinitely older, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. It felt like the crushing weight of the deep ocean, like the endless void between the stars. It was a power that demanded obedience from creation itself. Alistair stumbled backward, his heavy chair scraping loudly against the stone. His chest heaved as a cold sweat broke out across his brow. The entire court gasped in collective shock. The Alpha King, a man who had stared down armies without blinking, was retreating from a kneeling scullery maid. "Get her out of my sight," Alistair choked out, his voice a guttural, strained command that barely masked his rising panic. "Throw her in the eastern tower. Now." Guards rushed forward, hauling a bewildered and terrified Gwendolyn to her feet and dragging her away from the banquet. As the heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind her, Alistair sank into his chair, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly the thick oak began to splinter. His chest tightened painfully. He had finally found his fated mate, the other half of his soul. Yet, the entity residing inside her was something his primal instincts recognized as an apocalyptic threat. A predator so absolute that even an Alpha King was nothing but prey. Moonlight bled through the iron-wrought windows of the eastern tower, casting long, skeletal shadows across the freezing stone floor. Gwendolyn sat huddled in the corner, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. The cell was stark, containing only a miserable pallet bed and a single woolen blanket. Confusion and terror warring in her mind, she replayed the events of the banquet over and over. She had felt the mate bond snap into place the moment their eyes met a sudden, rushing warmth that felt like coming home. But it had immediately been replaced by the king's undisguised horror. Why had he looked at her as if she were a monster? She was the weak one. She was the anomaly, the girl missing a soul. Deep within her chest, something shifted. It was a sensation she had experienced faintly throughout her life, a cold, heavy pressure behind her ribs whenever she felt threatened or deeply sorrowful. Usually she dismissed it as a phantom ache, a physical manifestation of her grief. Tonight, however, the pressure was suffocating. It felt alive. It pulsed in time with her heartbeat, radiating a chilling, absolute calm that frightened her more than the king's guards. 3 floors below, in the king's heavily fortified war room, Alistair paced like a caged animal. He had cleared the room of everyone except his most trusted confidant, and Beta, Lord Hudson Reed. "You are losing your grip, Alistair," Hudson said softly, leaning against the massive mahogany war table. Hudson was a pragmatist, a man of logic and strategy. "The court is whispering. They saw you flinch from the Hayes girl. Lord Harrington is already using this to question your stability. You need to execute her or claim her. Locking her in a tower solves nothing." "You don't understand, Hudson," Alistair growled, his golden eyes flashing erratically. He dragged a heavy hand down his face. "The moment I looked at her, the bond struck. She is my mate." Hudson froze, the color draining from his face. "The wolfless girl? The daughter of Arthur Hayes?" "Yes," Alistair snapped, his voice vibrating with suppressed panic. "But that isn't the problem." "Hudson." My wolf submitted. It didn't just submit, it tried to flee. There is something inside her. Something ancient. When I looked into her eyes, I didn't see a woman. I saw an abyss. It smelled of ozone and death. Hudson frowned, crossing his arms. "She is 22 and has never shifted. Madame Agatha examined her years ago and declared her utterly devoid of lichen magic. Perhaps your wolf is merely rejecting a broken mate." "My wolf is not rejecting her out of pride," Alistair countered, slamming his fist onto the table, splintering the polished wood. "It is rejecting her out of survival. I am going up there. I need to know what I am bound to." The climb to the eastern tower felt like a death march. Alistair dismissed the guards stationed at the heavy iron door and unlocked it himself. As the heavy hinges groaned open, the freezing air of the cell rushed out to meet him. Gwendolyn scrambled to her feet, pressing her back against the damp stone wall. In the pale moonlight, she looked devastatingly fragile. Her dark hair fell in unkempt waves around her pale face, and her coarse dress offered no protection against the winter chill. "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice rough. Alistair stepped into the room, kicking the door shut behind him. The heavy metallic clang echoed loudly. He took a slow, calculated step toward her, fighting the overwhelming urge to close the distance and pull her into his arms, while simultaneously battling the freezing terror radiating from his inner beast. "What are you?" Alistair demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Gwendolyn flinched. "I don't understand the question. I am Gwendolyn Hayes. I am—" She swallowed hard. "I am nothing. You know this. The entire pack knows this." "Do not lie to me!" Alistair roared, the sound shaking the dust from the rafters. "My beast is the apex of our kind. It bows to no one. Yet, it cowered before you. There is magic clinging to your bones, Gwendolyn. Dark, ancient magic. Tell me what lives inside you. Or by the goddess, I will tear you apart to find it myself." Tears spilled over Gwendolyn's lashes. "There is nothing inside me. I have prayed to the goddess every night since I was a child. For a wolf, for a shift, for anything that would make me normal. I am empty." As she shouted the last word, the heavy pressure in her chest snapped. The air in the stone cell plummeted to a sub-zero temperature in a fraction of a second. Frost instantly crystallized across the stone walls, spreading like silver spider webs. The torches lining the corridor outside flickered and died, plunging the tower into suffocating darkness, illuminated only by the harsh moonlight. Alistair was violently thrown backward, slamming against the iron door by an invisible, crushing shockwave of kinetic force. He gasped for air, finding none. The gravity in the room had increased tenfold. He fell to his knees, his bones groaning under the immense unseen pressure. Gwendolyn wasn't touching him. She stood frozen against the wall, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror at what was happening. But her eyes were no longer hazel. They were glowing a terrifying, luminous silver that illuminated the tear tracks on her cheeks. "She is mine," a voice echoed in Alistair's mind. It did not belong to Gwendolyn. It was a voice composed of grinding tectonic plates, howling winter winds, and absolute, sovereign authority. "Touch her with malice again, little king, and I will reduce your bloodline to ash." The pressure vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Alistair collapsed onto the freezing floor, violently coughing as oxygen rushed back into his lungs. The frost on the walls began to melt, dripping rhythmically into the sudden silence. Gwendolyn collapsed onto her knees, sobbing hysterically as her eyes faded back to their normal earthy hue. "I'm sorry," she wept, wrapping her arms around her head. "I don't know what that was. Please, please don't kill me. I don't know what that is." Alistair pushed himself up, his entire body trembling. He stared at the weeping girl, his mind reeling. She was not a witch. She was not a rogue. She was a vessel. Before Alistair could speak, the distant, frantic ringing of the courtyard alarm bell shattered the night. The heavy, rhythmic pounding of war drums echoed from the valley below. Alistair rushed to the iron-wrought window, looking down at the sprawling courtyard of Castle Airy. Chaos had erupted. But it wasn't an attack from the rogue factions of the northern reaches. Men bearing the silver and green crest of Lord Richard Harrington were storming the lower gates, cutting down the king's loyal guards in a brutal, coordinated surprise attack. Harrington had used the king's moment of distraction, the perceived weakness of the Alpha retreating from a wolfless girl, to launch a bloody coup. Alistair turned back to Gwendolyn, his expression hardening into stone. The King of Ethelgard drew his heavy broadsword, the steel singing sharply in the quiet room. "Stay behind me," Alistair commanded, the mate bond overriding his terror. Whatever monster lived inside her, she was still his, and he would slaughter anyone who tried to take his kingdom or his queen. Swords clashed violently in the echoing stone corridors as Alistair dragged Gwendolyn down the spiraling staircase. Men wearing Harrington's silver and green colors swarmed the lower levels, cutting a vicious path toward the royal chambers. Alistair moved like a localized hurricane of violence, his massive broadsword cleaving through armor and bone with terrifying ease. He did not fully shift into his lichen form, knowing the narrow halls would restrict his colossal black wolf, but his eyes glowed with amber fury, and his movements were a blur of predatory speed. Gwendolyn stumbled behind him, her hand locked in his iron grip, her breath coming in ragged gasps as chaos erupted around them. "Keep your head down," Alistair ordered, shoving her behind a heavy stone pillar as a volley of crossbow bolts shattered the wooden door ahead. Hudson Reed rounded the corner a moment later, his own sword slick with crimson, accompanied by a handful of loyal guards. Hudson panted heavily, wiping soot and sweat from his brow. He quickly reported that Harrington had breached the lower armory and armed his men with silver-tipped weaponry. Harrington had planned this mutiny meticulously, waiting for a moment of perceived weakness from the throne. Hudson's gaze flicked to Gwendolen, a silent accusation hanging in the smoke-filled air, blaming her for the king's momentary distraction. "We push toward the courtyard," Alistair commanded, ignoring his beta's pointed look and tightening his grip on his hilt. "If we reach the outer gates, my loyalists in the garrison will rally and flank these traitors." Reaching the outer gates proved nearly impossible. Rebel soldiers poured into the corridor, effectively blocking their only escape route. Richard Harrington himself stepped through the ranks, a smug, venomous smile twisting his aristocratic features. He held a massive silver-forged battle-axe, the intricate runework on the blades glowing faintly in the flickering torchlight. "Surrender the crown, Alistair," Harrington drawled, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Your reign ends tonight. A king who cowers from a pathetic, wolfless scullery maid is no alpha fit to rule Ethelgard. Hand over the Hayes girl and I might allow you a swift, honorable execution before the court." Fury erupted from Alistair's chest in a deafening, earth-shaking roar that rattled the tapestries. He lunged forward, his broadsword colliding with Harrington's silver axe in a magnificent shower of orange sparks. Battle consumed the narrow corridor instantly. Loyalists clashed with traitors, the confined space turning into a brutal grinder of steel, fangs, and shifting beasts. Alistair fought with unmatched ferocity, driving the treacherous lord back step by step, but the sheer number of rebel soldiers began to overwhelm the king's small protective detail. A rogue blade slipped past Alistair's guard, slicing deep into his thigh. Another razor-sharp edge caught his broad shoulder, tearing through his velvet tunic. Gwendolen watched in mounting horror as the man who was meant to be her mate, the invincible Alpha King, began to falter under the relentless assault. Poison from the silver blades leached quickly into his veins, acting as a toxic inhibitor to his unnatural lichen healing. He dropped heavily to one knee, raising his sword just in time to block a lethal downward strike from Harrington's heavy axe, but his legendary strength was visibly failing him. Tears blurred Gwendolen's vision as a profound, agonizing desperation clawed at her fragile heart. She could not lose him. Even though he feared her, even though she was a broken vessel in the eyes of his pack, she loved him with a fierce, sudden intensity born of the sacred mate bond. Deep within the cavernous void of her soul, that primordial entity stirred once more. This time, it did not awaken with cold, defensive fury. It awoke to her devastating sorrow. "Let them shatter," the ancient voice whispered, echoing not just in her mind, but physically vibrating through the ancient stone foundations of Castle Airy itself. Shadows violently erupted from Gwendolen's trembling frame. It was not mere smoke or parlor magic, but absolute living darkness pulled from the spaces between the stars. The unnatural night exploded outward in a massive shockwave of kinetic terror, instantly extinguishing every torch, lantern, and hearth fire in the corridor. Screams of absolute horror replaced the sounds of clashing battle. The darkness moved like a sentient beast, wrapping tightly around Harrington's men, lifting them effortlessly into the air, and crushing their expensive silver weapons into useless, powdery dust. Silver light blasted intensely from Gwendolen's eyes, illuminating the dark corridor in a harsh, celestial glare that cast long, monstrous shadows against the walls. She stepped out from behind the stone pillar, no longer a terrified maid, but an avatar of pure destruction. The entity inside her was a primordial void walker, an ancient guardian spirit older than the moon goddess herself, bound to the Hayes bloodline for millennia to protect the ultimate balance of the world. It had remained dormant for generations, waiting for a threat great enough, or a catalyst strong enough, to warrant its apocalyptic awakening. Harrington dropped his ruined axe, his smug arrogance evaporating into pure, unadulterated terror. He tried to run, desperate to escape the suffocating aura of the entity, but the living shadows snapped mercilessly around his ankles. The darkness dragged him violently across the rough stone floor, forcing him to stop directly at Gwendolen's bare feet. She looked down at the treacherous lord, her glowing silver eyes radiating zero empathy and absolute judgment. "You dare strike what is mine," Gwendolen's voice echoed, layered heavily with the crushing dual resonance of the ancient entity. It was a sound that made the very air bleed and the stones weep. She simply raised one pale, trembling hand. Harrington let out a strangled gasp as the shadows violently compressed around his chest, draining the oxygen from his lungs and rendering him unconscious in an instant. The remaining rebel soldiers dropped to their knees, weeping uncontrollably and begging for mercy from the dark goddess standing before them. Silence completely reclaimed the ruined corridor. The oppressive, freezing aura slowly receded, pulling back into Gwendolyn's fragile body like a dark tide retreating from a stormy shore. The blinding silver light faded from her eyes, leaving her swaying, exhausted, and terrifyingly human once more. She collapsed forward toward the cold stone floor, completely drained by the catastrophic expenditure of such ancient, monumental energy. Strong arms caught her securely before she hit the ground. Alistair, bleeding and panting heavily, held her tightly against his broad, muscular chest. His amber eyes searched her pale face frantically, his expression a complex war of residual awe, fading terror, and profound, overwhelming devotion. The sacred mate bond hummed wildly between them, validating the fundamental truth he had finally accepted. She was not a monster sent to destroy his pack. She was his ultimate salvation. "You saved me," Alistair murmured roughly, pressing his warm forehead against hers, completely ignoring the chaotic aftermath and groaning traitors around them. "You unleashed hell itself upon this castle, and you used it only to save me." "I was so afraid," Gwendolyn whispered weakly, her small hands clutching the torn, bloody fabric of his royal tunic. "I thought you would die in front of me. I don't want to be a monster, Alistair. I just want to be yours." "You are my mate," he vowed fiercely, his inner wolf finally understanding the beautiful, terrifying dynamic of their union. The beast inside him did not need to dominate her to prove its strength. It needed to stand beside her and protect her mortal frame. A king ruled the earth, but his queen commanded the cosmos. "You are no monster, Gwendolyn Hayes. You are the Queen of Ethelgard. Anyone who says otherwise will answer directly to my fangs." Weeks passed quickly, completely transforming the political landscape of the Northern Highlands. Harrington's failed coup was violently dismantled, and his surviving loyalists were permanently banished to the frozen wastelands beyond the protective borders. Gwendolyn's sudden ascension to the throne was met with unprecedented awe and a very healthy dose of terror. The arrogant nobility, who had once mocked her mercilessly as the empty vessel of the archives, now bowed their heads so low, their noses practically brushed the polished stone floors whenever she entered a room. Lady Genevieve Croft fled the capital entirely, utterly terrified of the new queen's unimaginable wrath. Gwendolyn spent countless hours in the royal archives, but no longer as a lowly servant cataloging mundane records. Under the fierce protection of her Alpha King, she researched the most ancient, forbidden texts, finally uncovering the complete truth of her mysterious lineage. Her father, Commander Arthur Hayes, had always known the sacred secret. The Hayes family were the designated keepers of the void, a secret sect tasked with harboring the primordial energy of creation and destruction to prevent the world from falling into chaos. The entity only fully manifested when the living host found their true anchor, a mate possessing a spirit strong enough to ground the catastrophic, universe-ending power. Alistair's indomitable alpha soul was that perfect anchor. Standing gracefully on the high balcony of Castle Airy, Gwendolyn looked out over the sprawling, snow-covered valleys of her vast new kingdom. She wore a heavy cloak of exquisite black fur, a delicate silver crown resting perfectly atop her dark, wind-blown hair. Alistair stepped up quietly behind her, wrapping his massive, scarred arms around her waist and pulling her back flush against his solid chest. His chin rested affectionately on her shoulder, his amber eyes scanning the peaceful horizon with absolute, unwavering contentment. "Citizens in the lower villages are already composing songs about you," Alistair chuckled softly, his warm breath creating small clouds in the freezing winter air. "Rumors claim you literally swallowed the sun to protect the king. Let citizens whisper their tales." Gwendolyn smiled genuinely, leaning comfortably into his strong embrace. The heavy, cold pressure in her chest was no longer a constant source of terror or isolation, but a quiet, thrumming companion that reminded her of her vital purpose. She was born without a wolf, lacking the standard magic of her peers, but she had inherited something infinitely more powerful. "As long as you do not fear me, my king, the rest of the world can think whatever it pleases." "Never again," Alistair promised solemnly. turning her gently in his arms to capture her soft lips in a deep, branding kiss that sent sparks racing through their shared bond. He had faced massive armies, conquered vicious rogue nations, and forged an empire in steel and fire. But his greatest, most treasured victory was surviving the terrifying, beautiful abyss that lived inside the heart of his fated mate. Together, the mighty Alpha and his Shadow Queen would rule the Northern Highlands, forming an unstoppable force of nature and night, forever unbroken. If you enjoyed this dramatic tale of alpha wolves, ancient magic, and fated mates, please hit that like button and share it with your fellow fantasy lovers. Subscribe to our channel for more epic werewolf romances, thrilling medieval battles, and mysterious twists. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below telling us your favorite part, and stay tuned for our next adventure.